Hey, how you doing? It's Joshua Bishop. Today I want to talk to you about something that I call the two worlds problem. In reality, it could be the multi-worlds problem, but I'm focusing on its expression between two people and what that creates. There's an ancient parable that came out of India about a group of blind men who run into an elephant and try to decide what it is by touching it. One thinks it's a wall, another a spear, another a snake, etc., based on what part they are touching. Many cultures, from the Buddhist to the Sufi, have some version of this parable, and it illustrates the two worlds problem fairly well. I'll summarize the problem as this. Two people can have opposing, conflicting views of reality at the same time, and both can be true with a little t, but not true with a capital T. Now, there will be points in this discussion where you may become angry with me and want to bail out. I ask that you hold on and hang in there with me. I think that by the end you might find it more valuable than you expect. So let me use some examples to clarify this idea. My father lived most of his life in a small area of a big city where he was the only white person for several miles. I would visit him there sometimes, and he didn't want me to go out. People would get mugged in the aisles of the grocery stores down the street or at the Burger King drive-thru in the middle of the day. The territory of two rival gangs was on either side of his house. Crime and poverty were rampant. Many of the homes on his street were burned out with broken windows, full of garbage, squatters. People would sometimes ring his doorbell at 3 a.m. and attempt to rob him, or he'd catch them lurking around his yard. One time, he even found a body in his front yard that had been dumped, probably by one of the gangs. During his life, he rarely left this area and was not well traveled at all. This was basically all he knew. Due to this life experience, he developed a racist worldview. In contrast, I've lived abroad for several years, and I've traveled extensively overseas and to almost all of the 50 states. While I myself have experienced violent racist attacks, my experience with multiple different races and cultures has been amazing and educational and very meaningful to my life. My worldview is quite different than that of my father's. Many times we tried to have discussions about this, which usually failed and ended in an argument or just giving up. This is not because my father is an evil person who must be shunned. This is because we were touching different parts of the elephant while blind. His life experiences were true. He only saw negative behavior and destructive culture. He wasn't exposed to anything else where he was living. I had not lived in his situation or had to confront what he did. When I would try to explain the limitations of his worldview, what he would hear is that I was invalidating his actual experiences. When he would tell me that I didn't understand, that I had no experience with these things, I would feel that he was invalidating mine. Eventually, I convinced him to move, and I took him around to different states and exposed him to different situations and cultures. He started to see other groups behaving in the same way as what he had experienced at his home, including poor and disaffected whites. Over time, as he added to his life experiences, his worldview changed and evolved. I could not convince him through discussion or debate because we were in two different worlds, both true but incomplete. Only a crossing over of experience into the other world allowed our perspectives to expand. Here's another example. I'm going to contrast two stories here. In September of 2021, an 8-year-old boy named Demetrius was killed in a gang shooting. The gang was targeting another man and accidentally killed the boy. Some of the reports say the man was standing in Demetrius's yard, while others say that the gang was targeting his 18-year-old older brother. After the shooting occurred, the police took the older brother, who tried to save Demetrius's life, into custody. It's unclear exactly why. Their mother, Latanya, was destroyed by these events. Senseless gun violence destroyed her entire world. In her life experience, the only thing that came from the existence of guns is pain and suffering. Now, a different story. There's a woman named Melissa that makes her living shooting and writing about guns for one of the big manufacturers. Her grandfather's .30-30 Winchester is an important heirloom in our family. It was passed down to her father and then to her and her brother. The family has built up many memories and spent time together hunting, range shooting, and telling stories. For her, guns represent family, good memories, and a dream career that she had long pursued. Safety and responsibility is built into their lives through each generation regarding the weapons, and they have not been touched by gun violence. LaTanya's truth is that guns are horrible and destroy everything that she loves. Melissa's truth is that guns are wonderful and have brought nothing but joy to her life. Both of these stories are true but incomplete. You cannot go to LaTanya and tell her guns are great, laws should be abolished, and everyone should have one. Equally, you cannot go to Melissa and tell her that her family's culture and heritage is evil and invalid. They're living in two different worlds. Now, there could be a third world here, hidden but implied by these two. Could it be that politicians and organizations use the existence of these two worlds to push people towards specific voting, purchasing behaviors, activism, and things like that? I can use many other examples from religion to abortion to immigration to politics. And in each of these examples, we could find where the two worlds, two completely different visions of reality collide. Hopefully the idea of the two worlds problem is becoming clear at this point. The collision of two contradictory life experiences provides a block to logical debate of these issues. Now I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about how the two worlds problem is used to direct people's behavior. One of my favorite psychologists is a man named Milton Erickson. He was a psychiatrist and a psychologist specializing in medical hypnosis and family therapy. He's generally revered and an important figure in the history of psychology. He influenced a concept called brief therapy, strategic family therapy, family systems, solution-focused therapy, and neurolinguistic programming. A brief note about neurolinguistic programming, or NLP. NLP claims that there is a connection between neurological processes, the neuro, language, linguistic, and behavioral patterns that are learned through experience, also called programming, and that these can be manipulated through various techniques. It has been called pseudoscience by some, but there are also numerous interesting examples of its effects. Now, what Milton Erickson practiced was not NLP, but his approaches are what people took and then innovated on in order to create NLP. But some of the techniques that he did use include indirect suggestions. This is a concept where the unconscious mind responds to opportunity, metaphors, and symbols, as well as contradictions. His approach regarding indirect suggestions was to make vague suggestions and then allow the unconscious mind to fill in the gaps, which directs the individual to where he wants them to go. I'll give you some examples of this in a bit. He would also use metaphor. He would give people metaphors as instructions, such as climbing a mountain or visiting a botanical garden. These metaphors direct the unconscious mind towards the implied correspondence. Climbing a mountain might evoke the idea of working hard and attaining a particular goal, things like that. He also had a technique called interspersal technique. This is the idea of seeding ideas by interspersing words or phrases within the context of a story or a discussion. This is sort of one of the parent ideas to parts of NLP. In one example, he was talking to a man who was suffering great pain due to a disease that he had and the surgeries that were performed on him. The man was very against the idea of hypnosis, and so this interspersal technique was employed instead. Erickson began to talk to the man, who was named Joe, and who was a retired farmer, in such a way as to program certain concepts into the man's subconscious that could potentially help him. Now I'm going to give you an example of a transcript from Milton talking to this farmer Joe. I wish that you will listen to me comfortably as I talk about a tomato plant. The seed soaks up water. Not very much difficulty in doing that because of the rains that bring peace and comfort, and the joy of growing to flowers and tomatoes. Maybe, and this is talking like a child, maybe the tomato plant does feel comfortable and peaceful as it grows. Each day it grows and grows and grows. It's so comfortable, Joe, to watch a plant grow and not see its growth, not feel it, but just know that all is getting better for that little tomato plant, and that it is adding yet another leaf and still another branch, and that it is growing comfortably in all directions. So if you notice in my little reading of that transcript, the repeated and interspersed use of certain terms like comfort and growth. The whole time that he was saying this to Joe, he's seeding these ideas within Joe's subconscious to try to help Joe overcome his situation. Joe's response to this technique was excellent, and during the following month he gained weight and strength. Only rarely did he experience enough pain to need aspirin or Demerol. You could chalk this up to the placebo effect. It really doesn't matter. The results were valuable. Another approach that he used was confusion technique, and I'll read you a sentence that kind of illustrates how this works. That which is now will soon be yesterday's future, even as it will be tomorrow's was. Thus, the past, the present, and the future all used in reference to the reality of today. So these verbal distractions are confusing and lead progressively to the person who's being subjected to them. It makes them develop an earnest desire for and an actual need to receive some communication that they can understand. So essentially, talking to somebody in a nearly nonsensical way puts them into a very attentive and receptive state because they're desperately trying to make sense of it all. A similar technique has been reported in the CIA's interrogation manual called the Alice in Wonderland technique. The confusion technique is designed not only to obliterate the familiar, but to replace it with the weird and nonsensical, normalizing lunatic behaviors and states of madness portrayed as sane. Although this method can be employed by a single interrogator, it's better adapted to use by 2 or 3 or more. When the subject enters the room, the first interrogator asks a double talk question, one which seems straightforward but is essentially meaningless and nonsensical. Whether the interrogee tries to answer or not, a second interrogator follows up, interrupting any attempted response with a totally unrelated and equally illogical question. Sometimes 2 or more questions are asked simultaneously. The pitch, tone, and volume of the interrogator's voices are unrelated to the meaning of the questions. So they might ask something like, "Why is the sky yellow?" but angrily and yelling at them like it's some important, urgent thing. No pattern of questions and answers is permitted to develop, nor do the questions relate logically to each other. In this strange atmosphere, the subject finds that the pattern of speech and thought, which he has learned to consider normal, have been replaced by an eerie meaninglessness. The interrogee may start laughing or refuse to take the situation seriously, but as the process continues day after day if necessary, the subject begins to try to make sense of the situation, which becomes mentally intolerable. It's kind of funny to imagine like these interrogators trying to get this person to give up the secrets and just acting like crazy people day after day until the person just kind of freaks out. Eventually in this process, he'll start to make significant admissions or even pour out his story in desperation to stop the flow of babble. This technique may be especially effective with orderly, obstinate types of people. Now, Milton Erickson didn't use this in the way that, say, CIA interrogators would. He used it just to create a sense of attentiveness and alertness where the person's very receptive, trying to understand and figure out what's going on. And then he would apply some of his other techniques to try to help the person. Whereas an interrogator is trying to break the person to the point where they're desperate to make it stop. The next technique is called resistance technique. Instead of a common approach of saying, for example, "Tell me everything about your problem," Erickson would do something more like saying, "There are a number of things you don't want me to know about, that you don't want to tell me. There are a lot of things about yourself that you don't want to discuss. Therefore, let's discuss those things that you are willing to discuss." This gives the patient sort of blanket permission to withhold anything and everything. And because of this permission, they feel a sense of safety and trust with the therapist and tend to discuss everything, even things they would have normally resisted talking about. My favorite of Milton's approaches is one that he calls the double bind technique. Erickson tells a story about the first time he remembers intentionally using this technique, and it occurred early in his youth. One day, with the weather well below zero, his father led a calf out of the barn to get water. After the calf had drunk water, they turned back to the barn, but at the doorway, the calf stubbornly stuck its feet in the ground, and despite Erickson's father's pulling on the halter, he could not budge the animal. Milton was outside playing in the snow, and observing this, he began to laugh. His father challenged him to pull the calf into the barn himself. If you can do better, go for it. Recognizing the situation as one of stubborn resistance on the part of the calf, he decided to let the calf have opportunity to resist, since that's what it wanted to do. So he presented the calf with a double bind by seizing it by the tail and trying to pull it away from the barn, while his father continued pulling it inwards. The calf chose to resist the weaker of the two forces and went into the barn, dragging Erickson behind him. The takeaway here is that when an individual is presented with a strong pull in one direction, they tend to resist. However, if they are presented with two opposing pulls, they will tend to resist the weaker pull and comply with the stronger. At this point, I invite you to start thinking about how these approaches might be applied to you in society, especially in the realms of politics and corporate marketing. Now let me discuss another individual that I found to be very important related to these ideas. His name is Edward Bernays. He's referred to as the father of public relations, and he was very influential in a thing that we call propaganda. He was born in 1891 and died in 1995, and was very active between the 20s and the 50s. An interesting side note is that his uncle was Sigmund Freud, and he learned from Freud's ideas and applied them in his career. He worked for many major corporations as well as with government agencies, politicians, etc. Some of the things that he did include: he was hired by something called the Committee on Public Information to help build support for World War I. He referred to this work as psychological warfare. It was during this work that he realized the techniques he was using to drive public opinion about the war could also be used to drive it on behalf of organizations during peacetime. In 1929, he worked on an effort to promote female smoking by branding cigarettes as feminist torches of freedom, essentially tying together the ideas that if you smoke, you're strong and independent and can decide for yourself. Another thing that he worked on was the United Fruit Company in the 50s that was connected with a CIA-orchestrated overthrow of the elected Guatemalan government in 1954. Another campaign he did was to convince the American public that bacon and eggs was the all-American breakfast. Before that, wasn't necessarily true that everybody ate bacon and eggs for breakfast. In the 1930s, his Dixie Cup campaign was designed to convince consumers that only disposable cups were sanitary, and he did this by linking imagery of an overflowing cup with subliminal images of genitalia and disease. He helped the Aluminum Company of America to convince the American public that water fluoridation was safe and beneficial by using the American Dental Association in a highly successful media campaign. Fluoride was sort of a byproduct of industrial processes, and they were trying to find a way to dispose of it. And so he helped them with this campaign. He also started a campaign to convince women to grow their hair longer so that they would buy more hair nets. Shorter hair was in fashion at the time. Although the campaign failed to influence very many women, it did convince government officials to require hairnets for certain jobs. Because of this requirement, sales of hairnets went way up. That sort of shows an example of the manipulation of people's world perspectives combined with government regulation in benefit of corporate marketing campaigns. Bernays also worked with Procter & Gamble for the Ivory brand bar soap. The campaign successfully convinced people that Ivory soap was medically superior to all other soaps. So at this point, I would ask if you see any patterns today in your life that might be a result of this approach. If we take Erickson and Bernays together, could it be possible that a connection is being made between our personal life experience, that which colors and creates our worldview, interspersed ideas in marketing, advertising, news reports, opposing pulls on our beliefs, one slightly weaker than the other, and Bernaysian marketing tactics are all being used to try to convince us and drive us towards certain actions. What do we really know for sure? Several years ago, I was flying across the country from Washington, D.C. to San Diego. On a layover in the Midwest, I was browsing the airport bookstore and I saw a copy of a news magazine. It was something like Newsweek or USA Today. I wish I would have bought it. Or one of those type of magazines. And it had a picture of Trump shaking hands with some foreign dignitary on the cover. And the headline said something like, "Trump reaches deal with so-and-so." I didn't think much of it at the time. I'm interested in politics because of the psychological aspects and the various global effects, but not because I'm a fan of a particular party or back any candidate. So I looked at it and moved on. When I landed in San Diego, I was walking by the airport bookstore there, and I did a double take. I saw the same day's edition of the same magazine, but this time the cover photo was different. It showed Trump kind of aggressively standing over the same person as in the first photo. So it was a different angle. They weren't shaking hands. It kind of looked like Trump was bullying the guy. And the headline said something like, "Trump intimidates so-and-so." It was then that I realized that a framework of truth, but with nearly opposing details, was being presented in two very different ways by the same media organization, depending on the demographics of the readers, one in the Midwest and the other in California. I'm pretty positive that this exact sort of thing has happened with many politicians and issues over the years. This creates a two-world problem. Those people in one part of the country have a totally different view of reality based on the information they are presented. It's hard for a person to distinguish between what they see on the news and their own lived experience. Now, both of those photos happened. Both of those photos have an element of truth in them, but they seem to oppose each other. I have seen studies that indicate that talking about something releases similar chemicals as actually doing the thing. This is sometimes why we might talk about going to the gym but never actually go. You aren't going to be able to have a debate between someone in San Diego against someone in, say, Kansas about the nature of Trump's actions with that foreign diplomat. Each has a different life experience that is true. One of them saw the friendly president making an agreement and shaking hands. The other saw a bully tarnishing America's reputation on the global stage. What's worse is that their source of information was the same. I'm beginning to see a pattern where two or more worlds exist, and one of them tries to manipulate the other. One of the places where people develop their experience blocks, like the building blocks of their experience, which constructs their worldview, is the news. More and more, it's becoming social media as well. You can find hundreds of examples of the media on any side of the political spectrum attempting to construct or feed into people's worldview with false information. For example, CNN reporter Charles Jaco was famous for covering the 1990 Persian Gulf War. There was a particular broadcast he did that was supposedly on site. The Saudi Arabian hotel in the background was actually fake palm trees and a blue wall in a studio. The clip of what was happening behind the scenes was leaked by CNN staff. At one point, Charles Jaco wore a gas mask and his fellow correspondent, Carl Rochelle, wore a helmet as if they were under some sort of attack. There were sirens and missile sound effects that were a part of the stage set. The camera never panned out or showed the sky or anything that was actually happening because they were on a studio set. NBC and MSNBC correspondent Brian Williams was caught lying about an event that occurred while he covered the Iraq War in 2003. He reportedly claimed that while reporting in Iraq, the helicopter that he was on was fired at, hit, and needed to undergo an emergency landing. However, the soldiers that were on board the aircraft disputed what he said. He was also accused of making up a story about seeing a body floating in front of his hotel in the French Quarter of New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. These guys are trying to construct a worldview and give you simulated experiences that make that worldview more real in your mind. In a leaked video, ABC News anchor Amy Robach complained to a producer off air that she had convinced one of Jeffrey Epstein's victims to speak on the record about her allegations against Epstein and others who were reportedly involved in his trafficking activities, including former President Bill Clinton, attorney Alan Dershowitz, and Prince Andrew. But ABC refused to run the story, according to her, in order to keep access to the British royal family because of Prince Andrew's alleged involvement. This is happening in the news media where you're presented a view of reality. That view feels like an experience that you're having, and it constructs your worldview. Other people are presented a different view of reality with a different set of experiences. And then the two collide, and both people think the other is absolutely insane. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit to another important psychiatrist. This one is named Ewan Cameron. He was the president of a whole bunch of different medical societies. He was the director of the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal between 1943 and 1965. And he had an obsession with technology which helped shape his psychiatric thinking and approaches in the 50s. Cameron believed that technology could help generate a psychiatric revolution. He thought conventional therapy that involved talking, listening, and trust building was slow and ineffective. Cameron instead subjected his patients to a new treatment designed to accelerate the psychological process. He called this treatment psychic driving and used a reel-to-reel tape machine, one of the technological aspects of his approach. You might have heard the term psychic driving before in the Hannibal Lecter TV show. Psychic driving was a two-stage process. First, painful memories and pathological behaviors were annihilated from the patient's mind through what's called electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. While most of his peers at the time limited ECT to 12 shocks per month to avoid damaging short-term memories, Cameron increased this to 12 shocks per day in order to use the memory side effect to his advantage. Then patients were placed in front of tape machines that were giving endlessly looping messages designed to push them towards particular psychiatric epiphanies. For example, one tape said, "Peggy, you have discovered that your mother never wanted you. Can you see now why you have given affection in such a lavish degree to your children, and why you become so desperately anxious when your daughter decides to enter a convent?" So this would play over and over and over and over again, making the patient listen to it constantly after having gone through a bunch of electroshocks. The electroshocks sort of erase some bad memories, and then this repetition places this idea into their mind very forcefully. The messages would be repeated for days or weeks or even months in order to overwhelm the patient's conscious defenses. When patients became distressed by the relentless repetitions, they were restrained using a variety of methods. Sometimes their headphones would be taped to their heads, or they would be immobilized with hallucinogenic substances. The results of this approach were devastating. Rather than overcoming their conditions, patients often emerged with severe memory loss, unable to recognize even their own families. He had some pretty radical ideas about psychology. The only cure for mental illness, he theorized, was to eliminate its carriers from society altogether, either through means like psychic driving or more darker ways. Cameron believed that mental illness was literally contagious, that if you came into contact with someone suffering from it, you would begin to produce the symptoms of a mental disease. Now, another interesting thing that I've studied in the writings of a Harvard anthropologist and ethnobotanist named Wade Davis is that in the country of Haiti, the Bokors, which are sort of dark voodoo magicians, poison people with pufferfish tetrodotoxin and possibly other compounds. This toxin renders the person paralyzed and with very faint vitals, so their breathing and heart rate are drastically reduced. The country doctors in Haiti would often pronounce them dead, not knowing that the vitals were just very slow, and then have them buried. The Bokor would then dig them up after a period of time and administer a concoction made with what they called the zombie cucumber, which actually turns out to be a plant named datura or gypsum weed. This plant would revive the person from the tetrodotoxin poisoning and cause a type of delirium, which made them very suggestible, and the Bokor would sort of turn them into a slave. In Haiti, there was a doctor, marque duion. He was the leading psychiatrist and director of Haiti's only psychiatric institute, and he studied this zombie process extensively, taking on several people who had gone through this traumatic experience as patients. Before doing this work in Haiti, he studied at McGill University in Montreal. He tells a story about when he was at McGill, his advisor, who was none other than Ewan Cameron, his advisor had never heard of the datura plant. Duion was telling him about the zombie process and different things about voodoo and how the practices were performed. Cameron suggested that he conduct tests using the various plants that were involved in zombie culture and voodoo culture. So one of the experiments that they did was to give a preparation of datura leaves to mice, and they induced a catatonic state for several hours. These experiments stopped when Cameron left the institute. Cameron went on to work for the CIA's Project 68, furthering his work in behavioral modification. Continuing on this Haiti theme, in his memoir, My Life, former President Clinton wrote an account of a trip that he and Hillary undertook to Haiti in 1975. Bill Clinton wrote that the most interesting day of the trip happened when he and Hillary got a chance to see voodoo in practice in a village. The priest that day was someone named Max Beauvoir, a former chemical engineer who had studied at the Sorbonne in Paris. Beauvoir had abandoned that career when his voodoo priest grandfather died and named him as his successor. Beauvoir gave the visitors what Clinton described as a brief course in voodoo theology. And then they had a late afternoon voodoo ceremony. I'm going to quote what Clinton wrote about this in his memoir. After several minutes of rhythmic dancing to pounding drums, the spirits arrived, seizing a woman and a man. The man proceeded to rub a burning torch all over his body and walk on hot coals without being burned. The woman, in a frenzy, screamed repeatedly, grabbed a live chicken and bit its head off. Then the spirits left, and those who had been possessed fell to the ground. Clinton wrote that his brief foray into the world of voodoo furthered his fascination with the way different cultures try to make sense of life, nature, and the virtually universal belief that there is a non-physical spirit force at work in the world. So these are things that Clinton wrote, not what anyone said about him. These are in his own words. I heard a story once from a friend about Operation Uphold Democracy. This was the U.S. invasion of Haiti that was designed to remove the military regime installed by the 1991 coup that overthrew the president Jean-Bertrand Aristide. I have no way to be sure if this story is true, but what my friend told me was that the U.S. sent in an operative to learn voodoo concepts from a hungan, which is the word for voodoo priest. Now, the term voodoo is really incorrect. There's tens or even hundreds of different religions that all kind of stem from a parent religion in the west coast of Africa, Benin, the Congo, Yoruba land. Voodoo is just sort of like the Americanized blanket term for all of these different religions. But I'll continue with that term here just for simplicity's sake. One thing I wonder is if this Hungan could have been Beauvoir or if it was somebody else. Anyways, after his time there, this operative designed a patch using the voodoo principles that he had learned. And this patch was something that the U.S. forces could wear when they went into Haiti for Operation Uphold Democracy. He told me that because of this patch, no one would attack the American forces. Like, the people of Haiti saw it, recognized it, and basically just submitted. I looked it up, and there was only one casualty reported for the entire operation, which is quite remarkable. In this case, there were two worlds: the world of Washington, D.C. and its interests, and the world of Haiti and its beliefs. So my thinking about this is that instead of debating or trying to convince each other, one world, the DC world, learned about the other world, Haiti and its beliefs, and then used this knowledge to its advantage. When confronting a two-world situation, I myself have found it best to try to understand the opposing world and the experiences that make it up, rather than attack or invalidate the person that lives in it. It is possible to provide inputs into that world using a variety of techniques that we have discussed, but I don't particularly like some of those approaches myself. I prefer to offer experiences that expand the worldview and add to its completeness, as well as subject myself to experiences by going into that other world and trying to live it from their perspective. Now, dear listener, I would like to tell you about the tomato plant that gently pressed the like button. In the sunlight, it grew to subscribe to my channel, and its roots shared this video with other tomato plants. Thanks, and see you on the next video.